Election 2010, a special 1+1 featuring leading voices on the real issues facing Australia. Hello, I'm Jane Hutchin. Welcome to the program. Peter Shergold, NIck Xenophon and Alan Ramsey, all of them have witnessed our electoral system at close range. For 5 years until 2008, Peter Shergold was Australia's most senior public administrator, Secretary of the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, known as PM&C. In a long career, Professor Shergold has served 4 Prime Ministers from Hawke to Rudd. He now heads the Centre for Social Impact at the University of New South Wales. Peter Shergold, welcome to 1+1. What do you miss most about working with politicians?
I must say I miss this period, the caretaker period. I always joke to people from my experience as a public servant that this is the period where, in effect, the public servants are running the country. And it seems to run quite well. But, of course, this is the period as a public servant when you are very carefully monitoring every comment of not just the political leaders but other ministers and shadow ministers, and making up these wonderful books of the commitments that both sides have made, so that immediately you know who is the Prime Minister, then you have all the commitments prepared and ready to go.
Do they always stick with their commitments?
No.
How can they get away from that?
Well, often, to be honest, at some levels of the commitments made by a relatively junior minister haven't probably been focused on and often have had absolutely no media attention. It's only the fanatics in Prime Minister and Cabinet who watch carefully what everybody says. So that often you have the range of key issues. Nearly everything that has got media attention will be pursued. But below that, commitments made by ministers and shadow ministers during the course of the election are not necessarily implemented.
What do you think is crying out for reform in our electoral system?
Well, I suppose one of the difficulties is whether, in fact, the participatory democracy we have now is really working in the 21st century. I mean, if you think about it, the levels of political trust, not just here but in the United Kingdom and the United States, are falling. Far few people are joining political parties. Compared with a generation ago, far fewer people are members of trade unions. So the normal ways in which people used to engage with politics between elections has fallen away. Now, luckily, what's emerged in its place is this wonderful cacophony of community organisations in the social area, environmental area, heritage and arts area. And many people now, of course, find their political articulation through those organisations. Unfortunately, it's not captured very much in the political campaigns. They don't really get much of a voice, however, during the campaign itself.
Is that a reason, then, that the parties, at least in the current election, seem to have very similar policies? In a way, there's not a lot that separates them.
I think it's true they tend to focus on the same issues. And I suppose one of the frustrations, and it's inevitable within the system we have, is even when there is a substantive issue, you often don't get much strategic conversation
about it. Why is
that? Well, I think it's just too difficult. Sometimes it's because both sides are putting away a major issue. So there's been quite a lot of talk of environment in the election campaign. Both sides have put forward worthwhile initiatives. But the difficulty is you've got this £800 gorilla that actually isn't in the room. And the £800 gorilla is, are we going to set a price on carbon and when? Either through an emissions trading scheme or through a carbon tax. So you have a discourse going on about environmental issues, but it's like it comes across as a grab bag of promises and initiatives rather than a genuinely strategic conversation. We did the same, didn't we, with on sustainable population. No problem with discussing sustainable population, but it disappeared in the first week because neither side really wanted to have a discussion about this, which wasn't just about demography or immigration, but about infrastructure planning.
How can politicians get away with that, not actually mentioning the issues that really matter in those bigger debates?
I think a campaign is probably not the time to have a real strategic conversation of these issues.
It's not the time?
Probably not. I mean, you need to do this over the course of, the 3 years that exist. And that's why I think there need to be opportunities for more ongoing participation. I mean, the trouble is, in this election, if you think about it, Julia Gillard offered something that was really interesting, which was this idea of a citizens' assembly to discuss where we needed to go in terms of our carbon emissions.
It's been criticised, though, because it's like it's farming out.
It's come across as, this giant focus group, as a farce. And it was the right solution presented in entirely the wrong context. Because
How so?
It was seen simply as another means of procrastinating into the future to avoid making a decision and, in effect, to avoid making a commitment during the election. And yet, there are new forms of democracy now emerging, driven in part by social media, in which you can have citizens' assemblies and people's forums and citizens' juries, and indeed your good old-fashioned town hall meetings can reinvigorate, I think, a political dialogue which the old institutions of the political parties and the trade unions used to give you, but don't anymore.
So do you agree with the old adage that politicians don't lead, they follow?
Well, sometimes politicians lead and sometimes they follow. I mean, if you think back to previous prime ministers, they often stood out. If you think of John Howard, you think not just of the GST, but in his first term, the position he took on gun laws. And obviously the whole issue of financial deregulation, not just with John Howard, but with Paul Keating and Bob Hawke. Clearly there was leadership going on there.
What about at election time, though?
It is relatively difficult unless you've really built the ground first. And that's one of the difficulties. So if I look by comparison at the United Kingdom, where you have Cameron coming on and with a very big reform agenda, whatever you think of it, embraced under the big society. I mean, that's really been built up over a number of years. And that's why you need that ongoing participatory democracy, so that when you actually come to the elections, you can have serious discussions about big issues.
You mentioned earlier the situation in the United Kingdom, where David Cameron obviously is working very closely with the Liberal Democrat leader Nick Clegg. In the United States, President Obama picks people from all sides of politics to work with him. Are we in danger of looking like a throwback in Australia, given the style of our politics at the moment, which is very adversarial?
Yeah, well, I think one of the challenges we've got, of course, is at the federal level, the very short time period. 3 years is significantly different from a 4 or even a 5-year term. There's less time to do things, and of course when polls start to go bad, as we saw with Kevin Rudd, often the governing party has to make very quick decisions about how to address the situation. So I think the short election cycles here do contribute to that. But also often what happens is real reform often comes when a party has been in opposition for some time. I mean, Cameron's Big Society didn't come out. I mean, that came out of a long period in opposition and a recognition that there needed to be a real strategy to present as an alternative.
Do you agree that a party should be able to remove its leader even when the leader is the Prime Minister?
Yes, I do. And I do because we have a parliamentary system of representation. I think, however, many Australians are confused, not at what looked like the speed and the efficiency with which the removal took place, but how it's possible, because most Australians see politics in terms of the elections every 3 years, and those are necessarily presidential in style. So we have a parliamentary system joined up with a presidential form of election campaign.
How would you characterise this election as opposed to all the others that you've seen?
Well, you know, it's a bit of a junkies, a political junkies election, I think. I mean, I follow it closely, but it's so curious. You've got what looks like a pretty close election. You've got two leaders who are thoroughly interesting people and quite distinct from each other. It's taking place at a time of enormous global uncertainty. You would think it would be, you know, a really exciting election. And yet the truth is, it hasn't turned out that way.
Why do you think that is?
I think probably because of the circumstances within which people have to couch their ambitions for the future, because on some of the big issues, such as environment or taxation, neither side really want to chance their arm at this stage.
What does that say of them as leaders, though, if they can't have that vision, that foresight?
Well, I think perhaps both of them do have that vision and their foresight, but the election campaign is necessarily constraining the extent to which they exhibit that.
Peter Shergold, thanks very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
The 2010 election campaign was an example of the bland leading the bland, according to NIck Xenophon, a result of the major parties' obsession with opinion polls. The South Australian senator, in office since July 2008, argues the solution is to see more independence in Parliament. Senator NIck Xenophon is speaking to Simon Royal.
Senator NIck Xenophon, welcome to 1+1.
Good to be here, Simon.
What do people get from having an independent?
Well, they get a lot. I like to think they get a lot. An independent doesn't have to have the views of the community filtered through a party room process or through the vested interests of various industry groups or lobby groups. And I think it's important that with an independent doing their job properly, can listen to the community, can act on those concerns, and can do it in a very direct way. And I think that's a good thing in a democracy.
Do you think you've been successful?
Look, I hope I have. I think I'm my harshest critic. I always want to do better, but getting $900 million in accelerated spending on the Murray-Darling Basin last year as part of the stimulus package, I thought was a good start for the river, and most importantly, it put a focus on the crisis in the Murray-Darling Basin at a national level, and we need to do that. We need to realise that water security in this country is quite fundamental. It's not just about the Murray-Darling Basin, it's also about cities using stormwater harvesting. It's about letting communities plan for the future and having a river system that can both balance the needs of